Today I will deliver this lecture on this concept, which I consider to be a concept, as my title suggests, that does not stand still. In a text published in 1976, Amalie Rorty wrote, quote, "The concept of a person is not a concept that stands still, hospitably awaiting an analysis of its necessary and sufficient conditions." End quote. I quote these words from the literary postscript of the volume The Identities of Persons, edited by Rorty, in order to point out their interest for a field of study which, at first sight, would seem to have only tenuous connections with the theory of character. The field in question is that which deals with philosophy of mind, emotion work, and the mind-body relationship. However, it was that brief reference to the concept of character as a dynamic entity that served as the starting point for Rita Felsky in her introduction to issue number 42 of the journal New Literary History. Quote, "Riffing off an observation by Amalie Rorty, we could say that the concept of character is not a concept that stands still." End quote. The context in which Felsky's words appear should be taken into account. This was the introduction to a special issue of New Literary History devoted entirely to the question of character. That introduction confirms the theoretical and epistemological resurrection of an area of study that was apparently exhausted, namely that of character. And I quote, "In the last decade, however, we have seen the sudden revitalization of a once moribund field." End quote. Finally, the parallel between the person in Rorty and the fictional character, according to Felsky, enables two distinct trajectories, one leading from person to character, and the other going in the opposite direction, from character to person. In short, people inside and outside works of art. Or, in other words, characters don't stand still. I'm not going to follow here the route proposed by that important issue of New Literary History. I would, however, like to stress its significance in the light of how narrative studies have developed in the last 20 years. What is more, there is no analysis in that comes at all close to that is important right now. Understanding the extent to which digital technologies and networking have resulted in the reconfiguration of a category, character, which had for centuries been content to stay put in the place that had been allocated to it by narrative. It is also important to observe that reconfiguration with a proper historic perspective, so as to identify some precursors of it, if I may put it, founding characters. The final words of Felsky's text seem promising in the sense that they announce something new. Quote, "No doubt a certain conception of what constitutes character, an idea of unified and changing, intrinsic or impermeable personhood, is no longer sustainable on theoretical or historical grounds." End quote. For me, that implicit promise of a new world in which character has to be reanimated raises a challenge, one with both a theoretical dimension and an analytic potential. And I shall respond to it in function of a major personal research project whose beginning I can locate, but whose end is not in sight. From this project, I will develop, for what interests me here today, certain emblematic texts, several suggestions of analysis, and references to a project that is already underway, Project Figuration da Ficção. What I read into this research project is a specific route from a conception of character as a static narrative element. I arrive at its reconstruction as a dynamic, unstable, even evanescent category. In short, character is a concept that does not stand still. In 1874, the great Portuguese novelist Eça de Queiroz published his first consistent and ambitious tale, involving the conditioning of character and the narrative work that this entails. It is a short story of some considerable length, entitled, in its English translation, The Idiosyncrasies of a Young Blonde Woman, a title which already tells us something. The story centers upon a character that is unusual, or rather somewhat strange. In a second-hand account, because it is told by someone that heard it and reproduces what he was told, we hear about an unfortunate amorous incident in which a young man falls in love with a blonde girl who turns out to be a kleptomaniac. The story does not end well, of course, and Macario, the protagonist, realizing his fiancée's predilection for stealing, decides to expel her from his life. Quote, "Go." And moving closer to her, he said, "You're a thief." End quote. Everything in this short story rings true if we take into account the aesthetic and ethical framework of realism that the young Eça had begun to adopt as his literary project. Namely, the characters are clear-cut and their values well-defined, determining behaviors and producing consequences that cannot be avoided, as if wishing to underline the principle of how character is stable and predictable. Eça offers a description right at the beginning which is exemplary. The narrator, having arrived at a small provincial hotel and climbed to his room, sees what it is described in the text as follows. Please, this is the text. Had a problem with shoes and with feet, and this is true. There are two discursive procedures combined here. First, the way the guest's shoes and boots are described in itself reveals a great deal about the social, cultural, and professional aspects of these characters, who are fixed in stable roles. In some cases, these roles are very close to what we call social types. They are objects of a certain nature which announce the characters that are associated with them. In short, tell me what kind of shoes you wear, and I will tell you who you are, to the extent that we don't need to actually see them. We let them sleep in peace because the principle of predictability has been confirmed, establishing a security regulation that protects the reader against surprises. In other words, the conventional realist character does not stray beyond the framework of behaviors attributed to it for the comfort of a reader that is passive and a little lazy. Curiously, the figure that I have called the realist character may actually be considered a regressive feature, and to prove this I shall compare it with narrative and fictional antecedents which earlier in the 19th century had proposed a dynamic and more modern concept of character. I am referring to certain key aesthetic concepts derived from the Romantic worldview, according to which textual practices and the figuration of characters were governed by the values of instability and change. The aesthetic of the fragment, understood, and I quote, La Coulabart, and Jean-Luc Nancy, the romantic genre par excellence, according to Labarthe and Nancy, already foreshadows a freeing up of language that the digital tools would later make fully effective. The romantic fragment brings with it, quote, the relative unfinishing, the variety and mixture of object that could be treated by a single collection of parts, end quote. The romantic character is similarly configured. In its nature, its social and moral attitudes, its reactions to life and to other men, it is a sign of permanent instability. The portrait that is drawn of it has difficulty to defining the feature of a character affected by change. It is the super energy of the romantic hero that precludes an image reduced to stable characteristics. Almeida Garrett, the most important writer of Portuguese Romanticism, seems determined to portray a character that is inconstant and vulnerable, something that is frequent in figurations of European Romanticism. It is a kind of impossible project, as we see in chapter 20 of Travels in My Homeland, Garrett's masterpiece novel, a hybrid account which combines elements of travel writing, the novella, the fragment, and the essay. It is in this chapter that the impossible portrait of the hero is spelled out, dispersed between commentaries, advances, withdrawals, and interpolations to the reader. And this is my text. Portrait, the typical romantic portrait of this character. Volatility and bipolarity are two terms which explicitly or implicitly appear in this figuration, which is condemned to be a failed attempt. In the case of Hesse's short story, the characters were recognizable only by their shoes, and nothing more was necessary for them to be identified and remain static. In Garrett's text, the character is in constant movement. The character in constant movement means that stabilization is not an option, which opened up the way to a dynamic condition long before the tools were available that today give full meaning to that potential. I know well that in Garrett's character, the tendency for change and bipolar oscillation has its roots, as I have already observed, in a worldview which makes that tendency necessary and justified. In other words, I am aware that mutability is not yet a property established by tools such as those that the digital world makes available within a framework of technical references that Garrett, of course, did not know. However, none of this prevented Garrett from conceiving a text in which I have long been able to read the assumption of a hypertextual logic inscribed in the genetic code of Travels in My Homeland. I recall what I defined in a 1999 essay as the hypertextual suggestions of the Travels in My Homeland, founded on principles which we recognize in hypertextuality per se. The principle of interactivity, translated into a conception of the reader as an entity that is challenged to react to the text. The principle of openness, which implies a text constructed as a syntagm of fluid syntax, permitting differentiated reading pathways. The principle of plurality, through the use of various genres and narrative levels. The principle of fragmentation of the text into autonomous units, which the reader works to interrelate. The principle of simultaneity of times and spaces summoned for a reception in which the past and the present coexist. The principle of playful activation through the cultivation of an attitude that vacillates between entertainment and knowledge, risk and security, the fictional and the real. Much of this in in my homeland and its characters, particularly in that protagonist of the unstable portrait of whom I have already spoken. And obviously, before Gareth was Lawrence Sterne, expressly mentioned in the prologue and text of Travels in My Homeland. And after both of them came the great Brazilian novelist Machado de Assis, an admirer of the author of the life and opinions of Tristan Shandy and also of Almeida Garrett. I shall give just one example, taken from the posthumous memoirs of Brás Cubas, the most Sternian of Machado's stories, published in 1881, almost 40 years after Travels in My Homeland. I shall again focus on character and its movements to reaffirm that dynamic condition which, long before the digital era, cultivated a figuration in constant mutation. In chapter 90, in virtual dialogue with the son that is about to be born, Brás Cubas, the protagonist, anticipates a future which involves the many facets and diverse conditions of that much longed for son. This is what the narrator says when he's thinking about his son still to born. This narrator, which was a character, continues his voyage in time, in which the character, who is practically virtual, still an embryo, is one and is many, simultaneously concentrated, multiple and radically subjective. How can we pass from 19th century narrative to the mutations and developments brought by digital media and technologies? The response that I shall try to give to this question does not cancel a certain narrative tradition and enunciation of the account story. It is understood as a precursor of narrative experience that the digital era has made viable. I am thinking of video games and certain tendencies and genres in particular, and in the narrative in its digital format and electronic environment. As regards video games, particularly those that manifest a certain narrative impulse, their association with the logic of the fictional story as such is justified in function of the various features that they have in common, namely, the advance of the story of game along a timeline, uncertainty as regards its outcome, the use of stimulation procedures with the voluntary suspension of disbelief, and also the representation of figures, avatars or characters that protagonize the action and display what appear to be human traits. The specificity of video games is defined in the following observation, quote from Mail Ryan. The only feature that objectively and absolutely defines video games is their dependency on the computer as a material support. End quote. From there, Mail Ryan adds, quote, but if there is a general tendency that distinguishes them from other formalized games, sports and board games in particular, it is their preference for organizing play as a manipulation of concrete objects in a concrete setting, in a fictional world, rather than on a mere playfield. End quote. The figuration of characters in video games takes on a special significance in this context. I am referring to those games in which the character plays an important role. He or she is, in the language of video games, a playable character. That is, a figure whose actions are decided by the player and not by the internal rules of the game. The process of identification between player and character, typical of this kind of game, occurs in the framework of effective interactivity, which is non-existent in the reading of the conventional novel. But that does not completely detach the relationship of the player with a playable character from that other more diffuse interaction provoked by the novel when a reader projects onto his or her own behavior something that he or she has read or believes he or she has read in the fictional character. The psychological and cultural condition that we call boverism as a character effect is a pertinent example of this, though by no means the only one. This implies that the narrative universe of video games, on the side of both authorship and interactive reception, certainly owes something to the persistent narrative memory which cannot be expunged. On the contrary, it is reflected in the construction of narrative video games and their characters. I believe, though I cannot prove this now, I believe that the behaviors and trajectories that the player attributes to the characters and the outcomes that result from this is an extension of the narrative's experience of motives, stereotypes, and human development that has such a broad tradition in Western culture. Another approach, which would lead me to make value judgments that I cannot do at present, would be to compare the literary character in its sophisticated complexity with the simplicity of the playable character. Instead, I prefer to emphasize the following point, that certain literary characters, such as those in Garrett and Machado de Assis, that I have called unstable and mutable, these characters prefigure what digital technology allows us to do with other characters in immediate contexts that favors limitless interactivity. In any case, whether we are concerned with the time of the 19th-century novel or the digital era, narrative was and continues to be a demanding and fascinating meaning-making machine. In all cases, it is important to note that the digital narrative enunciated in the electronic environment has overcome certain principles and routines that were and still are dominant in verbal narrative. First, textuality no longer obeys a linear logic. Second, authorship is no longer univocal, but instead has been opened up to collaborative composition. Third, the narrative composition is made up not only of words, but also of images, sounds, graphics, and so on. Fourth, the text is open to reading trajectories that do not obey a rigid syntax, but construct meanings through interactivity. Transmedia narrative releases fictional words from the restricted scope of literary narrative. I quote Frank Zipser. By now, fictionality has become an important notion not only in literary theory, but also in other disciplines, such as film studies, theater studies, computer game studies, and more generally, the philosophy of art. End quote. From here, it is a short step to two correlated notions. First, the transmedia character and the multimodal novel. As regards the second, I follow Wolfgang Hallett, who says that since the 1990s, an ever-growing number of novels have not merely consisted of verbal text, aggregating into the narrative discourse, itself a renewed concept, components such as typed, handwritten, or electronic letters, film scripts, websites, pieces of academic writing, and many other generic forms. End quote. The characterization of emergent narrative is deduced from the primordial concept of emergence, diffused through various disciplinary contexts. Proposed by Tinsley and Gallian over 2 decades ago, the expression emergent narrative brings to narrative studies the possibility of analyzing stories that have effectively emerged out of pre-narrative situations. From these pre-narrative situations, collaborative and interactive reading trajectories open out, generating a narrative which thus passes from the virtual to the active plane. I will not hide my difficulty, and it is certainly not mine alone, in fully apprehending character as an element renewed by narrative in digital support. I have at least 2 explanations for this. First, we are dealing with technologies in rapid change, not always motivated by effective needs of perfecting the available tools. Economic interests, which in the world of computer science intervene in research and development, create false needs, in short, at least for the current user. The industry that generates those expectations responds to them with new products, rendering obsolete operating systems and programs which become literally unusable. And thus, whoever today wants to read the founding works published by Eastgate in story space software, such as Afternoon Story by Michael Joyce, Victoria Garden by Stuart Malthrop, or Patchwork Girl by Shirley Jackson, has extreme difficulty in accessing the versions originally produced in that software. In addition to that, second explanation, the cognitive attitudes demanded by electronic literature derive from a communicational paradigm that is not established, or from a multiliteracy to which I have to adapt. I moved through Michael Joyce, 12 Blues, or Anne-Cécile Brandenburger's Apparition Inquiétante, 2 of the most famous electronic pieces of literature, and I situate myself in a context of interaction that dissolves and disperses the fictional character, which for me was a stable and sometimes friendly figure. It is not easy to erase from our cognitive routines a reading tradition which, particularly since the 18th century, has installed in our imaginary the faces and attributes of Robinson Crusoe, Tom Jones, Oliver Twist, Julien Sorel, Emma Bovary, Anna Karenina, and Don Fermín de Paz, the magistrate who in a provincial Spanish city seduced the beautiful Ana Osores, also called La Regenta. The same character, La Regenta, or perhaps already another, that I still recognize when I pass by the cathedral in Oviedo and come across a life-size statue as flagrant evidence of the survival of a fictional figure. After this, and other characters, modernist and postmodernist literature, from Mallarmé to Jorge Luis Borges, passing through Fernando Pessoa, Bernardo Soares, James Joyce, Kafka, Raymond Queneau, and Julio Cortázar, gradually announced, as yet without suitable digital tools, the communicational paradigm of electronic literature. And already before this, writers of the 19th century, I recall Almeida Garrett and Machado de Assis, sketched characters in whom we read a certain impulse to free themselves from narrative constrictions which do not threaten their congenital instability. That instability, in complicity with digital narrative in its different manifestation, is deepened in texts and proto-texts in which narrativity remains active or latent. Before the digital narrative and its evanescent characters, we could read Bernardo Soares' Book of Disquiet, fragments of Finnegan's Wake, or Rayuela by Cortázar. In all of them, there emerge, invariably in a diffuse form, figures that reject the consistent character constructed by the 19th century novel, or in an expression that evidently, as paternity, all are assimilated to the man without qualities, of a time of sick dispersion and ontological crisis without solution. Thank you.